stand by. Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's HUD Life After Deadlines conference call. Please note today's conference is being recorded. I will now turn the conference over to Ms. Marcia Tonkovich. Please go ahead, ma'am.
Good afternoon, everybody, and sorry for the short delay in getting started. This turned out to be a very popular webinar, and we have a lot of folks who were trying to dial in all at the same time, so we wanted to give everybody a chance to join us before we got started. So thanks for being with us, and we will go through, about 4 o'clock today. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce my speakers, my colleagues who are here with me. We will be putting the PowerPoints back up in just a moment. We just had a couple of minor inclusions that we needed to add in, so it'll go back up in just a second. So if you can't see any video or any PowerPoints, you will be shortly. But while we're doing that, we're going to go ahead and introduce our speakers today. So Jesse, if you want to say a word about yourself and our reason for talking today.
Beg pardon?
You're up.
Oh, I'm up.
Just introduce yourself. We're just an introduction, so introduce yourself.
I'm Jessie Anforth Combe. Sorry for goofing around, but we've got a little silly in the wait.
All right, great. And John?
I'm Laswick here with the NSP Program.
And Hunter?
Hi, I'm Hunter Kurtz.
The Hunter Kurtz.
The Hunter Kurtz, yes. And is there anybody else from HUD who's on with us that we need to introduce?
No, I think that everybody else is listening in and waiting for us to
screw up.
Yeah.
and we'll talk about it when we talk about the agenda here, guys, but we are making new policy and talking about new things here. So this will be an innovative webinar. But before we get there, we just want to remind you, I'm sure many of you have been on these webinars before, but in case you haven't, how to ask questions. So you'll see in the top right-hand corner of your screen that there is a button, and that button right now says feedback, and it should be green. If you'd like to ask a question, we'd like to ask that you change your button to purple so that we can keep a track of how many questions are in the queue and make sure that we actually answer them. And then if you would like to audio ask your question, press *1 on your phone, and that will put you into the queue, and we'll take the questions in the order they are received. When you ask your question, you can just provide your name, your first name. You don't have to provide your organization or your last name, although you're welcome to if you'd like to. If someone else has already asked your question, while you're waiting to ask it, press *2, and that will take you out of the queue. Go ahead and make sure you turn your button back to green so we know your question's been answered. If you want to ask a question by writing in, if you don't feel like asking it or the audio is an issue for you, you can also do it by way of Q&A, which is at the top middle of your screen. You'll see you can type in a question, and we'll keep a track of those and periodically answer those as well. So please feel free to ask questions throughout, and we will certainly try to get through all of them today. So with that, we're on to our agenda, and what we're going to cover today is a little bit of discussion of the difference between the expenditure deadlines that are coming up in the next year and then the year after that, and then how that differs from what you have to do at closeout and when you have to close out. We're going to try to give you a sense of what HUD is going to expect at closeout and the triggers and the timing of closeout, and then what happens after closeout. So your program income, how you continue to manage programs, if you want to have a revolving fund, what does that mean, and your ongoing responsibilities related to monitoring resale recapture, rental projects, as well as demolished and land bank properties. We do want to give you a heads up, as I mentioned when we first started, that the information we're providing you is literally cutting-edge policy. It was being developed as we put these together. So there is a final notice that will be coming out from HUD, or a series of notices, which will clarify what we're saying. We're doing this to give folks a heads up on generally what to expect, because there's been a lot of questions about this. But please watch for these notices that are coming out, and those notices will offer the final policy, so you should be following whatever is that final policy that comes out of that notice. So I think to sort of recap that and to reiterate that and also move us into the PowerPoints, I'm going to turn it over to Jesse, I believe, who will take the next few slides.
Yeah, I'm just going to get a word in here, because this first line, the difference between expenditure deadline and closeout, is 50% of the reason we have this webinar today. And so I want everybody who's listening to understand, and we're going to keep telling you this, that the deadline for expenditures is not the same as the closeout date, and in fact, we fully expect them to be 1 or 2 or maybe even more years in between those two dates. So you do not have to have every unit occupied by the expenditure deadline. So that's why we call it life after deadlines. We hope there's life after closeout too, but we're pretty sure there's going to be life after deadline. So I don't want to make you all repeat it, but repeat it to yourself in your head. There's a difference between deadlines for expenditure and the closeout date. All right, now Jesse may proceed.
Yes, and John's absolutely right about that one. Let's go ahead and jump to the first slide, just to go through the timing. This is the NSP 1 and NSP 2 life cycle. Obviously, the NSP 3 grants are a year behind. We're in a period now where we're lining up for another expenditure deadline in February and March of 2013. NSP 2 grantees, it's all going to be on February 11th. NSP 1 grantees are spread a little bit, so are NSP 3 grantees, but there are expenditure deadlines for all 3 programs sitting in February and March of next year. There's only a couple grantees outside that window of IFU days either way. You need to count toward the expenditure deadline. Just repeat again, we count toward the expenditure deadline, the expenditure of NSP funds. The definition of NSP funds is that it can be funds that you draw from your line of credit, or it can be program income. The term NSP funds means either one of those sources. And you're going to meet the expenditure deadlines. We all are going to meet the expenditure deadlines, right? And at that time period, and then you will continue to expend any remaining funds in your line of credit and program income and work toward meeting national objectives until you achieve the criteria for grant closeout. If you want to know where we're going on the criteria for grant closeout, we haven't published them yet for NSP, but there is a CPD notice for the CDBG program that walks you through it, and there's a CDBG entitlement program reg at 570. I want to say 509. So it's just technical stuff you've got to meet for grant closeout. You have to, and we'll walk through a little bit more of that, but it's technical things that you have to meet. You have to sign a closeout agreement. We all have to agree who's in control of program income and assets and, all that technical stuff. But one of the criteria for getting to, hey, Hunter just showed me I got the right citation. It is 570.509, 24 CFR. To get to grant closeout, you're going to have to show us that you met a national objective for at least the activities that add up to the funding amount that you met the expenditure deadline for, your original grant amount, in other words, for activities adding up to that much money. Then we'll do closeout. Closeout is sort of a process because we're going to be signing an agreement, and we're going to have to go back and forth a little unless you have an unbelievably simple program, it's going to take a little while to get all the information we need. Make sure your last report in DRGR is perfect. Remember, I've been on before telling you that all your quarterly reports don't have to be perfect. They just have to be as good as you can get them done. That last report, that final report for the grant, it's going to have to be perfect. You're going to be standing on that for all time, and it's the basis for your closeout agreement. You're going to be expending program income. If you are a CDBG entitlement grantee, or a state that gets CDBG, insular areas, and Commonwealth Puerto Rico, all of the various regular CDBG grantees, if you keep getting program income, it is going to be in perpetuity. The CDBG program is very sticky, and the NSP program rides on it. So that program income will come in, and it'll continue to be governed by program rules. There's a different treatment if you are a nonprofit lead grantee, and we'll get to that, but there's not very many of you, and there's a whole lot of people in the other boat, in the entitlement boat. You will be also monitoring during the affordability period. Whatever the affordability period is, either for the ones that you did before the end of the program or after. And you'll be reusing land banked or acquired and demolished properties. And we'll be looking for it says at the time of reuse, but I think we mean at the time of closeout, you're going to commit to land bank reuse of the properties held in your land bank within 10 years. The one thing that is not going to come forward, we have agreed, is that land bank, acquiring new properties to put in a land bank is not going to be eligible with this program income. Operation and disposition will be. The acquisition will be taken off the table as you pass back closer to the CDBG world post-closeout. Okay? Again, we're going to come back to the difference between the expenditure deadline and closeout. It's an apples and oranges thing. They really, expenditure deadline, meeting the expenditure deadline or failing to meet it and, you know, taking whatever corrective action HUD specifies, which could be recapture, could be other things, very likely to be recapture. It's just a precondition. It's one of many preconditions for grant closeout. We have to get through this expenditure deadline and check and make sure you made it. And then that's one of the preconditions for grant closeout. Some grantees, this is going to be the last precondition. We'll pass this deadline and they'll be ready for closeout. I don't know if we'll be ready to close you out, but you'll be ready for closeout. So the expenditure deadline is when you have expended an amount that's equal to 100% of the grant that you got. The grant itself and the line of credit is going to remain open and accessible in DRGR. After that point, if you fail to meet the deadline, we may limit it until we work out the reconciliation. But if you meet the deadline, we're not going to move on your grant until you are ready for closeout, which can happen later.
See why we call it life after deadlines? You keep living.
Yes, you keep living. Closeout is when you have your original activities. That's the term we're using to describe the activities that are covered by the grant, the funds covered by the expenditure deadline, the amount of funds. And the funds are also either fully drawn from DRGR, which is what we expect you guys to mostly want to do, or you relinquish the remainder of your grant. I'm pretty sure that we don't have too many people who want to relinquish the remainder of their grant, but it is open if you want to, bring on closeout. And it's very likely to occur after the expenditure deadline.
Or if it's $2.49 that's left, you might be willing to give up.
Yeah, it's not uncommon for a grantee to leave, $10 or less and relinquish it at closeout, but you don't usually see large amounts left. And some of you have doubled your grant.
Jesse, a few folks are having a hard time hearing you. They're emailing in, so if you could just get a little closer to the phone, that would.
Oh, that'd be kind of hard, but I'll lean over.
Okay.
And Hunter's doing something. Here we go. I hope this is better, because I'm projecting.
Yeah, that's much better. Thank you.
Okay. So just, be really, really clear that expenditure deadline, meeting the expenditure deadline is a precondition for grant closeout. It's not the only precondition, and they're not necessarily related otherwise. It's certainly not automatic, and you don't have to get to meeting a national objective as expenditure deadline. The expenditure deadline is an expenditure deadline. Meeting a national objective is another precondition for grant closeout, and you may, and for many of you on rental programs, will meet it after the deadline. Okay? So let's go ahead to the next slide. Your NSP expenditure deadlines, just a primer on this. The clock started with HUD signing her grant agreement. NSP 1 has to expend 100% within 4 years, and the notice, the October 19, 2010 notice says that if you get to the 4-year deadline and you have not met the expenditure requirement, HUD will recapture funds and reallocate them. NSP 2 and 3, NSP 2, you must expend 100% within 3 years, which means February 11, 2013 is your 3-year deadline. NSP 3 is 50% in 2 years, which is March and April 2013, 100% in 3 years, March and April 2014. In both those cases, HUD, the notice says that HUD will recapture or impose other corrective actions or sanctions. Some of you who have read the notice and are aware of that, I would not think that it would be a prudent way to run your program and betting that will go with other corrective actions or sanctions. I would bet on recapture. We do not know who is going to be sitting in the Assistant Secretary or Secretary Chair making that decision in 2013 and 2014. Run your programs and hit those expenditure deadlines, because if there's going to be any sanction other than corrective action other than a recapture, somebody's going to have to make a judgment call, and you don't know who that person is right now. And we don't know who that person is. It's just really unclear. If you want to be prudent and conservative, manage to meet the requirements.
In fact, there's a going away party for Mercedes Marquez that's happening right this moment. So
yeah, it involves desserts, and we're not there.
Right, so. But she is going back to California, and we will have an acting assistant secretary for the next few months at least.
Yeah.
Which is Mark Johnston from Special Needs Programs.
Yep. So on the NSP expenditure deadline, the total value of the grant award has to be expended. It can come from grant or program income. And we're going to double back and remind you that expenditure is not the same as drawn down in DRGR. If you are using the accrual method of accounting rather than cash accounting, encumbered costs also count. My understanding from our financial management division is that most governments in the United States, local governments, do use accrual accounting. So if a contractor completes a task, invoices the grantee, and you have not yet paid the bill, the funds are encumbered. And encumbered costs may be considered expended. To be considered encumbered, you have to have an invoice and not just a contract or completed work. You report your expenditures in your quarterly performance report every quarter. That's how we reconcile them to drawdowns and see what's different. But we do use drawn as a proxy in our weekly reports that we post, because we only get expenditures quarterly.
Those of you who are in NSP 1 and 3 didn't go through the exercise 3 months ago that we went through with NSP 2 to make this distinction. So we track the weekly expenditures that we can see through your draws. We track your draws, but you will have to, at the end of the time period, show in your QPR the accurate number of actual expenditures. So just get ready for that one.
Right, and we do a random sample verification, or if there's a finding on your expenditures for some reason, we check them all. So what is going to happen to the expenditure deadline? Yeah, that would be the next slide. Yeah, put your feet down, Hunter, and actually click a button or something, man. No, we're just, like I said, being a little bit silly here. If you've met the threshold, and we will at the deadline, we will give you 30 days to get all of your reporting in order for where you were as of the deadline, so you can do expenditures right to the last minute, and then clean up. If you're really going to do the brinksmanship, cut it that close. So at the expenditure deadline, if we find that you have met the threshold, you can continue to use your remaining money in DRGR for eligible activities. If you did not meet the threshold, and we verified that, we're going to recapture the unspent funds. For NSP 2, we cannot reallocate those funds. They will go back to the U.S. Treasury. The Recovery Act has the Pay It Back Act attached to it, and those are Recovery Act funds. NSP 1 funds and NSP 3 funds can be reallocated. As they pointed out, it's really unclear if we're going to be able to do any workout plans at the 100% expenditure deadline. I would bet on recapture. If we do recapture, we're going to have to make a finding of noncompliance and recommend, advise you to repay us the amount that's in noncompliance. We are not going to go for the whole grant amount. We will go for the amount that was unexpended. To answer a question, I got a lot this week at the Atlanta NSP clinic. Go ahead and do the next slide. Cool. We're working on a closeout notice. That's why this is advisory guidance that we're giving you. We're telling you where we intend on going, but until we clear it through the department, I can't promise you that every single detail is going to be this way, but we want to give you as much as we could for your planning purposes. You will not be able to close out until all funds are drawn from DRGR or you relinquish any unexpended balance. This will occur after the expenditure deadline. We are being broken records on this, but there's a reason, because we get asked these questions literally multiple times a day right now. The national objective for each of your activities has to be met and documented, and we're going to require you to complete your reporting in DRGR. And after closeout, if you're an entitlement or a state CDBG grantee, your continued reporting will stop being quarterly, it'll be annual, and it's going to move to IDIS. We're going to transfer some of the information from DRGR to IDIS to join the CDBG reporting and the CDBG action plans and the CDBG everything. It'll be essentially, as I understand it from talking to the IDIS people, a new fund type in IDIS that will mostly be like the CDBG type and only have a few variations to account for the differences in NSP eligibility and particularly land banking, and to wall off the NSP program income. The main reason for walling off the NSP program income is so that you can get the 10% admin dedicated to helping you monitor the continuing affordability. But it'll also help you in that it can retain some additional NSP eligibility beyond that. So you have NSP opportunities and responsibilities. Wait, did I jump a slide? What did I miss? Just that, guys. Like I said, we were editing this right up to the last minute. I did. I turned it the wrong way. Okay, NSP program closeout. Again, you don't have to meet the national objective by the expenditure deadline, although I'm not going to argue against getting people into houses sooner. You'll have a reasonable time frame after expenditure deadline, but you're going to need to meet the national objective and document that you met the national objective before we can close out the NSP grant. In most cases, of course, you're going to meet the national objective by LMMI occupancy of an NSP assisted unit, LMMH, low, moderate, middle income housing. Some activities that use area benefit meet the national objective immediately, and some are based on the end use of the property.
And we'll talk more about these later on.
Plus, there's this is basic NSP stuff that, if you've run the program a while, you probably know a chunk of things, at least about the basics on meeting a national objective. You'll have opportunities and responsibilities after closeout. Your opportunity is that if you're receiving program income, you will get to keep using it to operate existing or develop new NSP programs, lines of business, whatever it is you call it, carry out new NSP activities. The NSP activity we are taking off the table is acquisition for land banks, but we're leaving every other activity. It will be in the new IDIS fund type be available. As you know, most of them are available for CDBG anyway, so that will work. Responsibilities, several tasks are going to be required after closeout. You are going to have to track and reuse your program income. You're going to need to monitor the affordability period for your NSP properties in which you have NSP investments, and you'll have to track the use or reuse or disposition of grantee and subrecipient-owned property, including land bank property.
Let me just say that there's an opportunity here that we didn't really point out. Maybe we'll get to it later, but this money will continue to look and act very much like NSP funds in terms of eligible uses, except for acquiring property from land banks. But the 120% income level will be something that you can go to with this money. You will be able to continue to do new construction with this money. So it really will seem like very much like your current NSP program. So, we think that's an opportunity. I mean, there were good arguments both ways, and some people thought it should be CDBG. The secretary and the assistant secretary decided to keep it more like NSP. It does give you a sort of a complementary, some complementary activities and a little bit different target clientele. So none of that will change.
Okay. But finding the exact balance point is actually probably the trickiest part of us writing the closeout guidance, and we're definitely still working on getting the details really nailed down. If you're operating NSP programs after closeout, then if you receive NSP program income after closeout, you can continue to operate almost the same eligible program and eligible activities, and we will also have a capped amount for NSP program administration. It will not be the CDBG 20%. Okay, it will be an up to 10%, and it is going to be calculated the same way as CDBG because we're converting from a rifle shot program to dropping into the CDBG world, so it would be up to 10% of program income received annually. Same as CDBG, calculated the same way. Because calculating it differently would just be an unbelievable headache. It does provide a significant opportunity to continue to address affordable housing needs in your community. Homebuyer programs, rental programs, including special needs, related public facilities with the NSP 1 program income, and demolition. NSP 1 program income is earned in perpetuity by grantees and subrecipients, NSP grantees and subrecipients who are also CDBG grantees in those areas. The number of revolutions does not matter. The CDBG program, the underlying program, is very sticky for program income. It likes to keep it, and NSP shares that because it rides on that chassis. The date of receipt doesn't matter. The program income received after expenditure deadlines or closeout is still program income. The pending closeout notice that we're writing that will be showing up in the Federal Register is going to contain more information on use and tracking of program income after closeout, and there'll be even more like detailed technical information when the bridge between DRGR and IDIS is created, and we can really show you how to do it. Another advantage of shifting over to IDIS is, of course, you get the linkage to the new econ planning software, which is going to really, really help. Your target areas will be shown there, and you'll be able to amend them, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. It's going to be different for nonprofit grantees under NSP 2 after closeout. How many of those do you say we had, John? 14. We have 14 of those. The income coming back to a nonprofit NSP 2 grantee after closeout is program income for the first revolution, and it's miscellaneous revenue after. Now, it's also not completely program income. It must be spent for an eligible activity in an eligible target area, eligible use, and meet a national objective. But if it's received after closeout, the cross-cutting requirements are gone for a nonprofit. So that means environmental, Davis-Bacon, labor. That's what the OMB circulars say, and that is actually, we've never closed out anything on the NSP, on the CDBG chassis that would like this, but it looks like that's where we're going to come out. This is one of the points that we don't have fully cleared yet. We're just telling you this based on our reading of the existing rule and the decisions made by the Secretary and Assistant Secretary. So for those 14, this is where we're trying to go. Don't bank on it yet. You can read the regs yourself and check on it. We think this is where we're going.
The worst case, it wouldn't be any more complicated than the current program that you're running.
The guidance is forthcoming for how this is going to relate to PHAs and redevelopment authorities. The difference with these public or quasi-public nonprofits is that some of them are actually the grantee doing business as another organization, and these may end up being boutique closeouts where we have to pick through everybody's charters and agreements and figure out which requirements actually apply. We're hoping not. We're hoping we can get a single answer, but we have to work with our friends in PIH on the PHA one. And there are 5 PHA direct grantees, I think, something like that. Yeah, and a couple of redevelopment authorities. Program income after closeout. Oh, it's the same header of the previous one, but we have new words. The use of program income after closeout. You want to use it for NSP eligible uses, meeting a national objective, comply with cross-cutting other federal requirements. This is for obviously for the grantees that are also CDBG grantees or state CDBG grantees. Target areas can change over time. You can amend them. You will be in the con plan, action plan, CAPER world. You will be accounting for your program income the same way you account for your CDBG program income, if you have any.
So what we're saying there is that you will still have to have a target area, but A, you can amend it in the same way you can amend it now, and B, HUD will no longer be involved in that amendment process. So we want you to continue to focus, but you'll have a lot more flexibility in how you make those changes.
And I think this is probably a good place to say to NSP2 grantees, this means you too. We're going to unify as much as we possibly can. The post-closeout for NSP 1, 2, and 3 should be virtually identical. It's going to be very, very, very close to the same. That's one of our goals is, creating something that we can all manage over time when there's a lot less money involved and we're in the long, long term with, in our case, all of our term employees having moved on to other adventures. You must track and document your NSP program income receipt and use, and it's going to look a lot like CDBG program income receipt and use, except for the eligibility and national objectives. We plan to allow 10% for up to 10% for administration, including monitoring during the affordability period. The law makes the Secretary responsible for maintaining affordability as long as feasible, and this is one of the ways that we are addressing that statutory direction. However, we decided that the 25% low-income set-aside will apply up to closeout, to expenditures up to closeout, but it's not going to apply to program income received and expended after closeout because we expect that program income to be very lumpy. And it's very, very difficult to do housing development with unpredictable amounts of money that may be too small one year and too big the next year and just very confusing. So that is going to drop away after closeout. We are also urging you to consider depositing your program income into one or more single-use revolving funds, revolving loan funds, so that it's going to make it simpler to deal with in the long haul, to keep track of. It'll be in a separate set of accounts and easier to trace in the context of being managed alongside your CDBG program. And we're also urging it for nonprofits because, well, we'd really like to see this money continue to get used for NSP-type purposes. We have a bigger crisis than we have money to deal with, as I'm sure you're all aware. Revolving funds. Just a little quick primer on revolving funds. It's a separate fund or account that generates repayments for reuse for a singular activity, what I call revolving. You can't capitalize it with a draw. You can't dump money into an account and then wait to use it. But you can make loans for single-family housing and have in your program design, your action plan, that you will deposit the program income into your revolving fund and continue it revolving. It is sheltered from the rule that you have to draw your grant funds before you have to draw program income. But you do have to keep, a revolving fund has to be in an interest-bearing account, and interest on funds just sitting there has to go back to HUD. We actually give it to Treasury. And interest paid by borrowers and loan repayments, that's program income.
So Jesse, we actually have a number of questions backed up, and we're at the end of program income here. Would you like to take a few questions, or do you want to get through the slides?
Yeah, this is a break point.
Okay, John says we're at a break point, so let's go ahead and take a few questions, and then we'll keep overwhelming people.
Okay, so let me give you we have a bunch of written-in ones, and then Holly, I'm going to ask you for questions that are on the phone as well. So let's start with the first question, which is Steve. Steve's question is easy. He asked whether or not the PowerPoint presentation will be available. Yes, they'll be posted afterwards, but remember they're posted in draft because we are giving you advanced guidance on this stuff. So do take that with a grain of salt and make sure you watch for the notices. The next question from Loretta is, are the post-NSP-like activities limited to the original census tracts?
No. You would have to amend your program after closeout, or it depends on what period you're in. If we haven't closed out yet, then you can amend as you would now. If you're NSP 2, that may require you to bring it back to headquarters for re-rating. If you're NSP 1 and 3, it requires you to talk to your field office. Post-closeout, you will amend through the consolidated plan, inform your citizens of what you're doing, but it won't require a HUD pre-approval.
Yeah, you'll be doing it just like your CDBG. Citizen participation will snap back to regular CDBG citizen participation.
Okay. So that means you can change the location, but you would do it through your con plan post-closeout.
Your citizens need to be notified.
Okay, the next one is from Mindy. She asks, will program income earned after closeout still be subject to the 25% set-aside?
No.
No.
Okay. The next one comes from Mark. Will NSP property types remain in effect, i.e., does the property have to be foreclosed?
Could you repeat that?
I think what Mark is asking, John, is NSP now requires you to work on vacant, abandoned, or foreclosed properties. And he's asking whether those limitations on the types of properties you can address will remain.
I mean, I guess I've been assuming that, but I don't know that
We haven't formally addressed that. I just started getting asked that question a lot recently. And
I mean, if we're saying that this is in effect NSP light and not that light, you know, there's a few things that have changed, but for the most part, it operates like NSP. Then I don't know. I think that it would make sense to continue to work on these three property types, but we have to make that decision.
We don't know how far the lawyers would let us move also. So, you know, we need to look at that. I mean, the law both says that the funds are for these things, and it says it's CDBG, and you know, CDBG just doesn't really have a concept of ending, really. So we're picking our way through what goes away and what lasts from HERA, from the NSP statute. I think personally that the property types, because those are the property types that are causing the crisis in most of the areas that have received NSP funds, we should stick with the property types, but whether those property types need to be welded to the eligible uses in the same way, I don't know. And that's one of the questions we have to ask our lawyers that we can't answer yet today.
Keep in mind that property types are described in the legislation. So
right. There's a statutory thing going on here.
Okay. The next question comes from Kara. We will meet the expenditure deadline for NSP 1. We will not have drawn all the original grant before February 2013. How much time do we have to draw from the original grant allocation?
Well, we don't have a set time period, but you will have time to take down, you know, continue to spend out your line of credit. Now, if you have multiple activities and a lot of program income, that could be kind of confusing. So this is where the revolving funds come in, because that allows you to kind of, you know, instead of having one set of program income that you have to spend before you can do any next activity, if you have a revolving fund, you can stick the program income for that activity into that fund, and then if you need funds for a different activity, you can draw down from your line of credit for that different activity. So, you know, hopefully we don't have to get too complicated about this, but it'll sort of depend on whether there's any real time limit on the funds after the deadline date in terms of being out of the line of credit. But we'll work with you to make sure that you don't lose any of that money.
Yeah, NSP 1 and 3 don't have a statutory deadline date provided you meet the expenditure deadline. Inactivity in the fund can cause Treasury to close it. So we definitely need to work on making sure that you are drawing regularly from the line of credit. NSP 2, because it's in the Recovery Act and stimulus money, there's an extreme sense of urgency among the people in Washington who are watching over the Recovery Act as a whole, which includes the RAT Board, which is the assembled offices of Inspector General. So I would say...
That's an acronym, actually.
Yeah, it is an acronym, but it's called the RAT board. I can't help it. Recovery Act something board. Anyway, Transparency Board. Yeah, that's what it is, Recovery Act Transparency Board. And so I would say that we should all be feeling urgency. We got this money because there's a crisis, and we need to try to get it expended and demonstrate that it was needed because we have the data that shows it is needed, and get it out there for the people who need it. And if that means accelerating your expenditures to the point that you can expend your program income and your grant funds, that you're moving fast enough, then we will help you move faster. We'll get the TA there. If it means segregation of funds, using revolving funds and allowing subrecipients to keep program income and reuse it while you draw new activities with grant funds, we will help you do that. We modified DRGR to help with that accounting mechanism, which is allowed by the regulations.
Great. Okay, the next question comes from Lisa. Her question is, if you are a nonprofit grantee with local government consortium members or subrecipients, obviously NSP2, how is the revolution of program income treated for the governmental consortium members?
There's going to be, the answer is, it's not too complicated, but it's a little more complicated. It's one of the variations we've been looking at. This is also going to, there's another complication when state governments have given money to entitlement. In the case of the nonprofit consortium, the nonprofit lead member is going to be covered by the nonprofit requirements. But if their grant agreement, their subrecipient agreement with the consortium member allows the entitlement consortium member to retain program income, then that program income, I told you CDBG was sticky, will work out in the closeout agreement. That entitlement will be keeping track of that program income and reporting just its piece in IDIS. For a state that gave funds to an entitlement, if the state allowed the entitlement to retain the NSP program income, the same thing is going to happen. If the state required that the funds come back to the state will be the one keeping track of it. We can work out an alternative arrangement on that particular thing between states and entitlements at closeout if we need to, because either way it gets reported to us, so in some ways we're indifferent. If a state gave funds to a non-entitlement and they're going to close their NSP1 out and they allow the non-entitlement to keep NSP1 and the non-entitlement has NSP3, that's a variation we haven't figured out yet. It just makes my head hurt.
Okay, great. All right, we have a few more questions.
The whole thing makes my head hurt.
Well, at least we're getting through it, right? So, Holly, why don't we take some questions from the phone, and then we'll go back through the rest of the slides. We have about 12 slides left to go, and then we'll come back and take more of the written-in questions. So, Holly, do we have folks on the phone?
Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, that is star 1 to ask a question.
And Holly, do we have folks on the phone?
At this time, we have no questions over the phone lines.
Okay, so, Jesse, why don't we go ahead and complete the slides, and then we can come back to the rest of the written-in questions.
Okay, okay, we were just doing some moving around. We move furniture, during these to keep, our energy up. So what slide are we on?
Monitoring during the affordability period.
Monitoring during the affordability period. We are going to require limited monitoring of projects during the affordability period. There's going to be some monitoring for both home buyer and rental units. We're also going to be tracking disposition of NSP-assisted properties owned by the grantee and subrecipients. We keep promising more later on that. It's coming. If you have NSP program income, we're going to allow the use of 10%, up to 10% for administration, including monitoring. And if there's no NSP program income or remaining NSP admin money, it is going to be okay to use CDBG admin money to monitor NSP units. That's another one where we intend to go there, and we think we're going to be okay doing that, but we have to get that cleared. Monitoring during the affordability period for specifics in homebuyer programs. You're not required to track ongoing unit quality in CDBG, not required to keep track of homeowner income, CDBG routes for homeowners to make more money, or residency. But you are required to track the sales during the affordability period and follow your resale or recapture policy. For recapture, at the time of sale during the affordability period, the grantee is going to need to determine and collect the net proceeds based on the grantee's chosen method, remove any lien or deed restriction that's placed on the unit when the recapture period is, at the time of sale for recapture. And if the funds were originally provided as a loan, the funds recaptured are program income in the CDBG world, which is different from home.
Which means that you can charge or take 10% of that amount for administrative costs as well, which is I think it's different from the home program. So
right, if the funds were granted to the homeowner, if you granted them, a recapture is literally a recapture of grant funds. It is not program income. If the funds were loaned to the homeowner, then even if there were a zero interest loan, forgivable, and all that, if it was a loan, then the recapture will count as program income for CDBG.
You who are home PJs out there,
yeah.
It's a point that John made, which is all this money has to be used for the eligible uses, but under NSP, you do get to take the 10% for admin out of the recaptured funds that you get back, so that's a helpful flexibility.
Right. Okay, the next slide. For resale, that's okay, honey. There's a ghost in the machine that's doing it now. For resale, at the time of sale during the affordability period, the grantee has to document that the new buyer is income eligible. If the property was originally one of your set-aside units, then the household is going to have to be at or equal to 50% of AMI, area median income. Otherwise, the household income has to be at or equal to 120% of AMI if it's not a set-aside unit. If the home has to be affordable to the new buyer, the new buyer must occupy the house as a principal residence. The original buyer will get their fair return, and the remaining resale restrictions are imposed, if there are any, are imposed on the new buyer.
So that's pretty much the way that home operates it. So we're not really changing anything there. It's just that, if you're 10 years through a 15-year affordability period, then this new buyer is going to have to carry those affordability provisions for the next 5 years before they are finished.
I turned the page the wrong way again. So.
All right, so we're looking at rentals too, and there's a few differences between NSP and home because we didn't adopt 100% of the sections in 92-252. So you have to, most communities use the home as the safe harbor. You have to keep the rents affordable, which means you're going to have to review the rents on an annual basis. You do not have to review the incomes on an annual basis. You're required to share the new rent limits with the owners as they're published, and you have to document the rents charged to NSP-assisted units. So you're going to have to be getting those from your property owners or your nonprofits or your for-profit property owners during that time. But you're not required to do annual inspections either. So, it's a good thing to do that, but you're not required to. And you have to ensure that you've got basically the same tenant income eligibility. So if you had as in a owner program, if somebody's in at 50% of median income, then the new tenant is supposed to be 50% of median income as well. Now, if you're not monitoring the incomes annually, that particular individual may have gone over 50% during that time, and you won't even know that. But the new person coming in has to meet the income requirement. There is no We don't have fixed and floating units as the home program does. So if you have 20 units and 5 of them are supposed to be for very low income people, it doesn't matter which 5 as long as there's at least 5 that are comparable. And then when you sell a project, if the project is sold, they have to continue the quality and income and rent restrictions for the balance of the affordability period. And that'll happen. Somebody will sell it after 5 years or whatever, so that just all has to transfer with the title.
Okay, for the slides from here to the end, this is where we're really getting into draft territory. We're talking to you about some stuff that we're still talking about internally. And in fact, John and I were arguing about pretty loudly in the hallway as recently as an hour ago. So we are still hacking through the details on this, but we wanted to let you know where the big shape of sort of the 5,000-foot level stuff of where we're going on some of these issues so that you can line up and be ready for post-closeout. And I don't think it's going to be a surprise to everybody that a lot of these issues are hanging around the use of the property. Because the real estate nature of NSP is really the big thing that, harks back to maybe urban renewal even, but it hasn't been done on the scale of CDBG in a very long time. And we are having to build new policy, particularly as we move it back into the CDBG program.
Yeah, I think along with, some of this tracks along with land banks as, kind of new territory, literally, for us, because these are essentially purchases with somewhat unknown futures, at least for a certain period of time. And historically, we haven't had to deal with that in the block grant program. So, but we have a different program now, and we're trying to work it out. But let me say before, I think Jesse's right. I mean, these are, I think, still evolving, although I think we're not, I think the general shape of things is pretty close to where we'll end up. But I think up to this point, we're pretty, I don't see a whole lot of changes. I mean, the Assistant Secretary, Mercedes Marquez, and the Secretary did talk about these big questions, that it will continue to be NSP money, for example. That's really not an issue. I mean, there's some little fine points about, small aspects of that, but the big picture stuff is, of everything that we've told you so far, I think is pretty clear.
Well, CDBG operations, NSP eligibility. I mean, that's, grant operations, right, like the con plan and the annual nature coming back.
Right.
But NSP eligibility, grantees were very clear, those of you who gave us feedback. So let's...
So the questions that we've been getting a lot of inquiries about lately have to do with property that doesn't have an immediate future, and so or the planned future for it has not materialized, and so there's kind of 3 main categories: that properties that are being changed, that you're changing the use of after you've acquired them, properties that are in land banks and that need to come out of land banks at some point, and then properties that were acquired and require some redevelopment, but that the plan for redevelopment either has changed or has proven infeasible or any number of things.
So you haven't met a national objective. So one of the things that we're going to be talking about here when we talk about closeout, because meeting a national objective is one of the criteria for closeout, is in some cases we may actually have to be making findings and working out corrective actions through the period of a closeout agreement. And some of those are going to have to be, almost boutique, designed to the particular case. We're going to try to get the best general rules we can, but we know that you guys are operating in the real world. So after closeout, in general, you're going to have to track and document the end use or reuse of your NSP-assisted real property owned by the grantee or a subrecipient. You could be dealing with property that holding that you had an existing NSP activity and you're doing a change of use. I got asked 2 times in the clinic in Atlanta this week about properties where a grantee had acquired several single-family properties, taken them down, put a multi-unit structure on one end, and they wanted to change the use of the other end of the property and sell it. The answer is going to be different from NSP 1 to NSP 3, and we may be able to also intervene in the closeout and try to figure out ways to make that work better. But that would be an existing change of use where you met the NSP national objective on that property, but you don't need the whole property anymore. You assembled it and used part of it. This is particularly true for communities where you're re-densifying, as somebody said to me. I didn't know it was a word, but now I know. There's land bank property, obviously, where you've acquired it and you're holding it and you want to go to the ultimate disposition of the property. And some grantees have acquired property under B, C, or E. So under B and E, you acquired it and you're going to redevelop it. And C,
the land bank, and maybe you're trying to bring it out of the land bank.
Right. And the demolition just cuts across because you can't acquire under demolition. So you hadn't completed it, and we get to the point where you've met closeout for everything except that property. And we're going to have to figure out how to deal with some of those properties. Some of them may be a case of delaying closeout until that property is taken care of. Some of them you may sell the property out of the program and give us the fair market value back because you did your due diligence but you just can't get a project on that property. Some of you just bought properties at random. I'm not going to name any names. And those properties, those are going to be much more likely to draw real findings and to have us really have to, work on appropriate corrective actions, which may involve recapture funds. We seem to have a whole bunch of different cases of things in here.
Let me make a point, though, that was Jesse's point, and we weren't really arguing. We were just arguing emphasis.
Yes.
But Jesse's concern is that she's been talking to people who think that they've acquired property in order to demolish it, and therefore they didn't acquire it under B, C, or E. They acquired it somehow under D, which doesn't allow acquisition. And so that's one problem. So that's an eligibility problem. If you did something like that, let's hope that you can go back and look at that property and say, oh, it was foreclosed or it was vacant, and therefore it qualifies under B or E. So that allows you to establish an eligible acquisition, and then you've demolished it, which is eligible if it's blighted, and you've met, and then through the demolition, you've benefited the area, so you've met a national objective and had an eligible demolition, but you've only had an eligible acquisition. You haven't had an eligible end use or an eligible national objective for the acquisition part of it. So that's where we say sometimes the subsequent use or the end use is going to determine the national objective. And so your property may be sitting there without a clear future, and this is where we're trying to help you out with this. So
right, because eligible use B is acquisition and redevelopment, and we say ag rehab, but it can be redevelopment, and it doesn't have to be for housing, which is a fascinating part about it that most people haven't caught. And eligible use E is it allows acquisition and it's redevelopment. So it's like you have to do the and part. And that's what we've been talking about. Of course, if you have a privately owned property, we're not talking about change of use. The developer developed it. If they want to change the use, that's between the grantee and your agreements with them. This is not what we're talking about. It's properties owned by the grantee or subrecipient. Okay? What's the next slide?
So we talk about change of use here. Okay, so we're going to talk about change of use, land banks, and redevelopment. So it's possible to have a change of use similar to the CDBG program if it's been acquired or improved with $25,000 or more of NSP funds. And then you basically go through what's similar to an amendment process to notify your citizens and receive comments on the proposed change. And then if you're changing it, you must either meet a national objective after the closeout, or you have to sell it at the current fair market value and reimburse the NSP program. So we see this as being something of a last resort, but it is an option for those of you who just can't find a use for a property under your control, but maybe somebody else, maybe somebody wants to develop a different type of facility than you can develop, a business or something like that. That makes some sense. So.
And to be pretty clear here, you're not going to be able. I got one question. You are not going to be able to use CDBG to buy an NSP property because there's an OMB circular that won't let you allocate costs in one federal program allocable to another. But you may be able to use CDBG to do your redevelopment on an NSP property that will get you out from under, and then you would only be notifying citizens and getting comments on the change and not have to sell the property out of the program and reimburse NSP.
And guys, before we leave this, I think one thing that's important to clarify, and it ties back to Jesse's previous point about the private entities, is this is not a way around having to meet a national objective on a property owned by a private entity. That does have to meet a national objective. What we're talking about here is the reuse of that property. So in the case where it's owned by a private entity, it initially met the national objective, you're done. In the case of property owned by a grantee or the subrecipient, where you continue to own it, it's that reuse of the property that we're talking about here.
Yeah, change of use only happens after something meets a national objective. You're changing its use, and it's an amendment. You're notifying citizens in an amendment to your plan. You're changing its use to meet either a different national objective or a different eligible activity. The other key thing is that the word improved is a term of art in CDBG. It means to build something on. It does not mean to demolish something. Demolition doesn't qualify as an improvement, as a term of art. So demo doesn't trigger this 25K. So that's why the NSP program required, if you demolished and you didn't acquire, right, you just condemned demolished, that you had to put a lien on, because otherwise there was no remaining CDBG requirement or NSP requirement at all. So demolition is not an improvement in the sense meant by this acquired or improved terminology, which is actually lifted right out of the regs. And that's something that I know I've gotten asked about 3 or 4 times now. And being asked about it made me unsure, and I went and talked to the lawyers about it today. So, hot from the lawyers. Okay, where are we? Land bank? We're up to land bank. How is going to be? We're working on the guidance about disposing of vacant and land bank property. We're working actually on a memo, so this will come in advance of the notice we're working on. Tentatively, properties in a land bank are owned by the grantee or a subrecipient. When a property comes out of the land bank, the use of the property or the activity is going to have to meet a national objective, but it does not have to be an eligible NSP or CDBG use. It just has to meet a national objective. The eligible activity is disposition. All you're doing is conveying the land into the activity, the eligible activity is disposition, and you need to meet a national objective, but if you use other funds for the development or redevelopment or use of that land, you don't have to worry about ineligible activity. So the disposition could include sale to somebody that wants to build housing for people above 120% of median, or it could a parish forbid a house of gambling. Right. But you're disposing of it. You can also give it to some use that meets a national objective. So you could donate the property to a community organization that's going to do a community center or a community garden with their own money. You can donate it for economic development, infrastructure, drainage improvement. It just has to meet a national objective. And when we write the closeout guidance and cover this, this is one of the places where NSP is going to probably step closer to CDBG, or we will allow HUD to grant exceptions to allow it. If you don't want to use the 120% and you want to step back completely into CDBG territory, on this one, HUD will talk to you about it. Because we know land banks are mostly in areas that don't need to do housing and are not occupied and not residential anymore effectively. They're empty areas. So on this one, you may need to do other things than, you know, what we've been doing at NSP, LMMI, and LMMH.
And I think for both this and the next category, we are trying as much as possible to give you a range of options that will allow you a feasible way to satisfy the requirements without, you know, great expense or you know some ridiculous set of requirements. So we'll talk a little bit about this some more on the next one. But let me clarify that in order to be in a land bank, a property must have been foreclosed upon, whether it's got a structure on it or not. So there's a subcategory of projects, properties that have been acquired, maybe under eligible use E or as abandoned under eligible use B, that technically cannot go into a land bank. And so this is a group that's a little tougher to deal with, because with land banks you're going to get another 10 years pretty much starting at the date of closeout rather than when you acquired the property. But with these properties you won't have that sort of safety period.
Unless somebody changes the law, that wouldn't be on my wish list at all.
Right. Could it be on mine?
You can be on your wish list. I'm pretty sure it's on several other people's wish lists.
Right. So yeah, I mean, maybe Congress will say, look, you know, a lot of these distinctions that we made early on don't really apply anymore. But I think we're trying to assume that everything stays the same and still come up with a list of options that's reasonable for people. So let's talk about redevelopment.
Vacant property.
Right.
Again, pending HUD guidance, we keep doing this. We want to make a point that if you demolish with no acquisition, the national objective is met by removing the threat to LMA. There isn't a change of use requirement if all you did was demolition and you did no actual improvement, no acquisition, no improvement, then redevelopment doesn't apply here. You're done. So that's why this is a note in here. What we're talking about is if you acquired under acquisition, you happen to have done demolition, the demolition has to meet a national objective. It's under a different eligible use. Your acquisition has to be under one of the other eligible uses. That's the only place that lists acquisition as eligible. So you're going to have to do the and. Acquisition and whatever is in that eligible use, and rehab and redevelopment, the and part. Or if it's eligible, it can go in a land bank. But if it's just vacant and you're under eligible use E, you have an and redevelopment.
So here's why we're saying that it depends on the subsequent use, because effectively there is no use now. And you could be in this category if you had just bought the property and it was vacant. It was vacant land, but you thought you could build on it, but you found out that you couldn't. So
we have a fair number of grantees who told us that financing has been falling through, and they can't find additional financing.
Right. Or you might find some site feasibility issues, you know,
right.
The soils don't allow you to build the way you thought they would.
And our approach on this is going to be different depending on whether you did your due diligence.
All right, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
So, but I want to make the point here again for Jesse's benefit that you have to acquire under B, C, or E.
Yes,
you can't acquire under D.
Correct.
Are you satisfied?
Yes, sir.
And okay, so if your property does not meet the requirements of being a foreclosed, abandoned, or vacant, then you actually may not have done an eligible acquisition either. So let's hope that's only a small handful of properties, but that's a different issue. But if you thought you were buying it under D and you actually were buying it under E, then you have to look at that eligible use and decide, well, what does that require me to do? Does that require redevelopment, as Jesse was saying, for E, or does it require redevelopment for an abandoned property under reconstruction for an abandoned property under B?
Hey, John, do we know what redevelopment means?
It's funny. I've heard that's not a term of art.
that if you give us a reasonable pitch on what does redevelopment mean, we can have a talk, right? It's not a term of art.
Right. So
it does. I mean, it may mean what you think it means, but it may mean that you go and plant flowers, I guess. I don't know. We have to talk about what.
It sounds like redevelopment to me.
Yeah, John thinks that's redevelopment.
I've seen some nice sunflowers in Flint. Okay, so.
I heard about those. Actually, somebody brought the sunflowers in Flint up at a clinic. Apparently, people drew a blank on that in Phoenix.
Really?
Yeah, apparently sunflowers don't do so well in Arizona.
Yeah, well. So, all right, so what do you have as options here? Then we think what we're going to be able to say is that, as we've been saying for a while, that you can sell or lease to the neighbor as a side yard. You don't even have to have an LMMI neighbor if you lease it or if you grant them an easement. I've talked to somebody last week who thinks it's a hassle to put an easement on it. That's up to you. We just are trying to give you ways of disposing of this without a lot of trouble. But if there's no neighbors, then there's nobody that needs a side lot. And so you might have enough people in the community to use a community garden or open space, or you may even have some wetlands or some general drainage and areas that could be pretty extensive even in areas that aren't very occupied at this moment. So in NSP1 you can use those, you could use the NSP funds for that, or in NSP2 and 3 you could use somebody else's money for that. But the ones we're really worried about are the properties that are stalled for some reason. And so here's the distinction, that you went into this with your eyes open and reality changed, and you can show us that you did some due diligence. We would probably make a finding, but we would allow you to get out of it through a sale. If you went into it with your eyes closed and then opened them and were surprised, we may want a more serious corrective action and possibly repayment of the funds. So you need to be talking to us now about these properties.
Yeah, talk to your NSP specialist, whoever it is that you talk to. We need to get a much better bead on properties that cannot meet or are not expected to meet. I won't say cannot, but aren't expected to be able to meet eligibility and national objective requirements, pre-closeout, not pre-expenditure deadline, but pre-closeout in a reasonable period of time from now, a year and a half, 2 years.
So let's pretend there's another slide here, and it's going to say, I projected that I would do 100 units, but because of market conditions, and even though I did my due diligence, I can only build 75 or 85 units. Am I going to be penalized?
Is this an NSP2 grantee, John?
This is anybody. So NSP2 will get some scrutiny, but we realize that these are goals and estimates, so we are not expecting you to hit your number exactly. I think the NSP2 community is trying harder, and I think it feels a greater burden, and in many cases I think they're going to go over their units. But
well, it was a competitive element, though, which is different. NSP1 and NSP3 grantees were coming in out of the CDBG world where they aren't really expected to make projections. And quite a few grantees approached me very worried about their projections over the last few weeks, and wanting to change them all the time. And some reps are telling me their grantees are like changing their projections constantly. And really, the projections are there as part of the citizen participation. They're actually there so you can tell your citizens what you reasonably expect to do. If you perform under or over, explain it in your narratives, in your QPR, but you don't have to keep changing your projections. You change your projections when a project falls through, you add or delete an activity, you get a chunk of program income and you're doing your amendment to budget the program income, and you do projections for that amount. But if you're running a single-family program and you projected 10 units and you're going to do 11, because, you're managing well. You don't have to change your projection. You just show us in your actuals that you did 11. If you projected 10 and you did 8, you just show us in your actuals that you did 8. The only time you're going to run into a problem from HUD on something like that is if you projected 10 and you did 1. And then we're going to go, where is the reasonable cost on that, and what the heck happened? Do you need TA?
Yeah, this is part of your best efforts. I mean, so if you're doing your best to make these things happen and you have good explanations and reasons for why they couldn't, we're going to be able to work with you a little more than if you have no explanations and no idea of how you got to this position. Then there's still time, because if you are stuck, we still have technical assistance providers and the money to pay them. So this is the time to get a hold of us, and in fact, we are going to be talking to our field staff about this very question. So you will be getting, you will be asked this question, but call if you're having this problem. We don't think, so far, we don't think there's that many people in this boat, but we don't know. But I got a question this morning from one of our technical assistance providers who said that in a grantee, they have made a grant to a developer, or made funds available to a developer to do several small multifamily projects. They have 2 more to go. The cost overruns on the first ones, which were not their fault, have left them with less money than they expected to have at this point. They purchased the properties, and they don't think they can afford to develop both of them. So what should they do? So assuming that they were doing things properly and that they didn't, make mistakes, or there wasn't fraud in the cost overruns, I suggested that they should see if they could redevelop one of these properties, and then we could most likely allow them, possibly with a finding, but that wouldn't be the end of the world, but possibly with a finding, to sell off the other one and reimburse the program. And then they'll come up 6 units or 8 units short of their goals, and that's not the end of the world. So I hope we're getting the message through that this is not an absolute set of lines in the sand here. As long as you're doing everything that you can do to achieve the goals that you set out for. And
John and Jesse, we have a lot of questions that are in, so would you guys like to take some more questions?
You can.
Okay. So what I'd like to do, guys, is, again, it's *1 to ask an audio question or a follow-up. While we let people get in that queue, I'm going to run through some of the written in ones. We have quite a lot. So the first one comes from Rhonda. She asks, will the NSP program income be incorporated, if the NSP program income is incorporated into IDIS under CDBG, how will it affect our CDBG 1.5?
Try that again. We had a distraction here. Say it again. How is it going to affect which CDBG rate?
The 1.5 expenditure requirement.
It's probably going to be excluded from the 1.5, but we will be checking to make sure that the program income is moving. We don't have a timeliness requirement for the NSP program income yet, but some grantees are earning so much NSP program income that when it drops back into their CDBG program, it could cause a 1.5 problem. We want to avoid that. But we will definitely come with a timeliness requirement on the program income, the NSP program income moving into your program. It won't get to just sit.
Great. Okay, the next one is from Joanna. Will there be guidance on how to create revolving funds with existing program income?
Yes, we're working on some right now.
And we're looking at doing a webinar.
Yeah, and there are some things out there on CDBG, guys. So if you're looking to kind of get moving, look at some of the tools that are out there on CDBG right now.
It's not that complicated, really.
And there is guidance for actually how to do in DRGR. the mechanics of it on the DRGR website.
That's complicated.
No, it's not. It's easy peasy.
I asked a question about the revolution of program income, but your question is cut off on the write-in, so if you want to call in or, again, write in your question, we didn't get the full question. Next question comes from Missy. If program income has been generated, but there is money left in our line of credit for a particular activity, can the line of credit be utilized for an eligible project, or does program income still have to be used first? Can we draw the line of credit after the expenditure date? That's the second question. So I think what Missy's asking, guys, is you've got program income coming from a particular activity, going to be reused for that particular activity. It's not in a revolving fund. And then we continue to draw out of the line of credit for other projects. And I think the answer there is no. If it's not in a revolving fund, you have to pay the first.
Yeah, that's when you need a revolving fund. But like we're saying, it's really not that difficult. So
yeah.
And then she asked, can we draw from the line of credit after the expenditure date? And so the answer is yes, as long as you've met the expenditure deadline.
Right.
It might be worthwhile to point out that just because you receive program income from one activity, you don't have to spend it
on that activity. Yeah, it's all about the amount of funds. Money is fungible, one of my favorite words.
Okay. The next question comes from Blair. Will NSP2 nonprofit grantees have to switch from DRGR to IDIS after grant closeout?
Only in California, Blair.
Only for the long-term affordability, or if one of them happens to be running a land bank.
Yeah.
I haven't checked yet to see if any of the 14 are running land banks.
It's highly unlikely.
But not for program income. They'll only go part way, and we'll only be looking at resale recapture.
Okay. Blair's next question: if you use a revolving fund, how often do you have to send the interest to Treasury, and how do you send it to Treasury?
We can issue the how do you send it to Treasury directions again. They're out there in the DRGR website somewhere. The how often?
Quarterly?
I think it's supposed to be quarterly.
I think the minimum requirement might be annually, but the recommendation is quarterly.
Okay. And for states, it will be different. States negotiate their own rules with Treasury, and I think that's one of the things they may negotiate on.
And I would say, guys, watch for the notice that's coming out, because I imagine that will be covered in the notice you guys are issuing.
Well, it's a Treasury requirement, so we may mention it.
But this is just for nonprofits. If you're an entitlement, you will be folding back into IDIS.
Okay, the next one is from Lisa. Can you please clarify the 25% set-aside requirement for NSP2? Does this get satisfied at the end of the expenditure deadline for NSP2 or at the closeout? So when do you document that you met the 25% set-aside, at expenditure or closeout?
Closeout. We will check it at expenditure. If you've blown it at the expenditure deadline, you're actually technically in violation of your certification. But we are so interested in getting that 25% done, we will not be closing out until you meet your 25%.
But you don't have to meet it. It is an expenditure requirement, though. So,
right.
So I think that may lead some people to think that we're looking on the set aside for those units to be occupied. That's not the case. What we'll be looking at is the expenditures, and as Jesse said, if you're way off, we'll be digging into it. But we understand there'll be a little bit of adjusting as they go forward.
Right. We're not expecting occupancy. It's expenditure. We'd love to have occupancy, but it's not what an expenditure deadline is about.
Okay. The next question is from Paul. Regarding revolving funds, shouldn't program income be sheltered after 100% expenditure deadline is met instead of after closeout? By making it after closeout, which can occur until grant funds have been 100% expended, doesn't this rule just prolong the problem instead of solving it?
Well, we are left today.
Yeah, you can do it now. We aren't saying that you do it after closeout, or you can only do it after closeout. You could do it after expenditure deadline. You could do it now.
It's easier to roll a revolving fund from DRGR to IDIS than it's going to be to roll a whole bunch of separate activities. That's really, why we were recommending it. If you haven't done one by closeout, if it's just about expenditure and trying to get at your line of credit, yeah, you should do an RLF. Make sure you're doing all the subrecipient sub-funds that you can do.
So, Paul, you could do one right now today if you have program income, and that would help you with getting the money expended.
Right, but you want to kind of plan that, because you can't just deposit funds into that revolving fund. You have to capitalize it with program income only.
Right.
Okay. I'm going to take one more written-in question, and then I'm going to go to the phone. So, again, if you're interested in phone, *1. Looks like I think it's Deb. What if a homeowner sells to a buyer who does not qualify for NSP and or does not accept the NSP terms? If the NSP funds are recaptured, is that enough?
That's one of those judgment calls that depends on the circumstances, but, I mean, it's not an automatic death sentence, if that's what you want to know.
It probably depends on whether you had resale or recapture as your criteria, because if you're doing recapture, you weren't required to sell it to somebody who qualifies for NSP, and they don't have any NSP terms, because you're just going to recapture the money. So it doesn't matter who they sell it to, at what cost, at what they accept. If, however, you had resale, that's where you're going to have a problem, because that was the deal, that you're supposed to resell it to a low-income person with the continued affordability period and all that. So that's where you might have.
And resale is a contractual matter, so they'd be in breach of contract, and we would expect the grantee to pursue contractual remedies, legal remedies.
Okay, all right, so I hope that helps. So let's move on, Holly, do we have people on the phone?
We do have 2 questions at this time.
Okay, so let's take our first caller.
Sure, absolutely. We'll hear from Herman.
Hi, Herman.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
We can hear you.
Hey, I have 2 questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, we'll let Liz.
Okay, the first question is about meeting national objectives for multifamily. Can you guys clarify what will happen, if we're, have say a 5% vacancy or whatnot once we reach the closeout of the program? Are those vacant units going to be deemed as never having met a national objective, and will there be some kind of circumstance for that? Or, this is not the second question, just the second part of this question. What if we had rented a unit and then it became vacant, so at closeout it actually is vacant but was actually occupied at one point in time?
Some of the answer on this is going to depend a little bit on which way you're going on the national objective. Because remember, we allowed you to go on a unit-by-unit basis if you're just like subsidizing part of the units in a property, or you could go with the CDBG structure basis. 51% of the units had to be low and moderate income. We are looking for initial occupancy. If you're going the 51% route, or actually any route, we'll wait and not close out until you have that initial occupancy. If you've had the initial occupancy and you now have 5% vacancy, I'm going to stand up and applaud.
Yeah, I mean, 5 or 7% vacancy is kind of standard level of vacancy. So you get to that, you're effectively fully occupied.
Yeah, and I guess I'm just more considering, the fact that when we said we would do 400, say multifamily rental units, right? That we were on the hook to rent, 400 units. If that constituted one multifamily project, for example.
We're going to look at each of your activities, each of your projects, to see if it's met a national objective on the terms that, you use. Because we provided a waiver that there's multiple ways to do this.
Okay.
Okay. When you've met a national objective for each of those, we'll check them off, and if things change, because things always change, people come and go, then that'll be fine. But with CDBG and then the NSP chassis, built on the CDBG chassis, you got to meet the national objective the first time.
Right, but I mean, the most stringent requirement we have right now is that you have 51% of the units meeting,
income.
Serving the income group that you require to. So once you cross over that percentage, that becomes 100% in the CDBG way of counting benefit to low and moderate income people, and we've transferred that over to our program. So,
but if you went the home way, which we allowed, then they have to meet, that number of units.
Yeah, if you were going to be 40%, then we'd look for the 40%. But I think full occupancy is still 95%. I don't think it's, realistic to expect to have no vacancies.
Right, I got you. Okay, now my second question is for, when you consider the, the idea of revolving your program income, one time, and again, we are an NSP2 grantee, so I'm asking, with our, with kind of our intent in mind and what you guys discussed. If you have a rental, say, let's just take a single-family home. So if we're renting a single-family home and we are generating rent, how is rental income going to be treated for the purpose of having recycled at one time?
Well, it's anything that comes in after your grant's closed. So, it comes in from that project one time.
You delete, you subtract the cost, that generated the income, and then you have a net amount. Then you would have to use that net amount for something that was NSP eligible, then an NSP national objective in an NSP target area, and then you would be done. And that would be the last time that of the 14 nonprofits, that would be the last time that you would be dealing with it. We would probably have one report and you would be out.
Well, what about next month's money? Is that different?
It's probably. The reporting's going to be annual, so it's going to actually kind of bunch up. We'll have to work out exactly how we do that. We haven't done this kind of a closeout, Herman, since UDAG, and so we're kind of digging back through to try to make sure we understand exactly how this is going to work. This is one of the areas where questions like that can really, really help us. If you guys want to, send in those questions, either through question by talking to your rep or your desk officer. Send them in through Ask a Question. You're going to get a note back saying we'll be answering them later with the notice. You can't expect.
Okay, yeah, because I think the whole idea of rental income is one that we really need to figure out, both for multifamily and then single family, especially if we have large scattered site deals. The fact that we purchased a house with NSP money, we've extended the money, and then as we're generating rental income on a monthly basis, that's the first cycle of program income. So do we need to now account for that monthly rental income for the purpose of extending it one more time so that then it washes? I guess that's where I'm getting down to, the nitty-gritty in terms of when we receive program income on a rental portfolio.
Sure that OMB has some rules on this, Herman. We haven't studied them yet, but this is actually a fairly common way for federal grants to close out in other departments. So, I think there's some protocols there. We need to figure out what they are. But I think if we do this, as Jesse's saying, on an annual basis, maybe for something like this where there's a recurring income stream, we say, well, the first year is it, and then after that it's done, something like that.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Let's take our next caller, and we do have a lot of questions backed up, guys, so I'll try to get through all of them. So, Holly, who's our next question?
Our next question will come from Casey.
Casey? Casey, are you there?
Casey, your line is open. Please go ahead. If you're on a speakerphone, please pick up your handset or depress your mute function.
Okay, Casey.
This is Kathy.
Oh, are you there?
It's Kathy, yes.
Kathy, okay, great.
My question, I'm still not able to pull up the handouts. Will that be sent to us at a later time, or can I pull them up now anywhere else?
It'll be posted on the website, so you'll be able to, download them and print them out probably by tomorrow or the next day.
Okay.
Remember, they're drafts. I'm deeply paranoid about this. We're kind of taking a risk here. We just wanted to give you some direction on where we're going, but wait for the notices to really lock in.
I understand. Thank you.
Okay, Kathy, great. All right, let me go back to some of our written-in questions because we do have quite a lot backed up here. So I think the next one is Paula. If we currently have NSP1 properties which are not sold due to the market and we are looking to rent them, are there specific rules or procedures to follow, and would those count as expended dollars? So they've got properties they intended to do as home ownership. They're now going to rent them. What rules do they have to follow, and would you count that as eligible expended dollars?
Yes, those are eligible, and if you put tenants that meet the income limits into them, you will be meeting the national objective. We have a little bit more flexible approach to short-term rentals than the home program does. I mean, you can certainly use their lease purchase model. We have been allowing grantees to go beyond the 36-month period on a sale, for example, or just to keep them as short-term rentals and then to convert them to ownership, which is a little different from what they do. But you know, we think that this is a different program for a different kind of problem. So we've made a few adjustments in that regard. But yeah, by all means, get people into the units. If they end up staying rental, you know, hopefully your rents are enough to support that. But if you can sell them, if you can convert them to ownership and give the people who live in them the first right of refusal, that'd be great. But it's not as automatic. It's not an automatic conversion to full-time, permanent rental situation after 36 months, the way it is in the home program.
And yes, we would count those as expenditures, provided you haven't told us that you're giving up trying to meet a national objective. I mean, this sounds like a case where you're trying to figure out a way to meet a national objective. You're still working toward it. You're doing your due diligence. You expended the money in good faith, and you'll get count for the expenditure deadline, and then we will sit there and wait until you meet a national objective so that we can close out.
Okay.
So, I mean, they're meeting a national objective if they have a...
Well, they have to get the occupancy.
Tenant.
Right.
Okay. The next question comes from Sandra. If a nonprofit has an entitlement jurisdiction as a consortium member, and the PI has already been generated by the activity and managed by the entitlement, and this PI has been used for all activities, no revolving fund, can we still set up a PI account by activity and credit the activity with the PI used by other activities?
That just really, really hurts my brain. I would have to actually see that in writing to figure it out, but you can't double back for money that you've already used and recredit in a different way. The money's not quite that fungible.
Yeah, I had this
question. The question.
Yeah, so I had a similar question last week, and I think the idea is that because they didn't have revolving funds, they were, you know, various members of the consortium are accruing program income, and then it's being spent on projects that aren't really their projects, so to speak. So now they have money in their line of credit that they have not had to use because they used the program income instead.
Right.
Can they take that money out of their line of credit and give it to the nonprofits that it sort of quote-unquote belongs to? And I said I didn't think so.
No, they can't. But you can create subrecipient EN funds, and we can walk you through that. It's a little different for the consortium, but not entirely. You know, and there's definitely a way to do this, but you can't be retrospective about it.
And Sandra, I would recommend if you have an idea going prospective for how you might deal with that program income, write it into the Ask a Question and set up what you'd like to be able to do.
Right. It's an NSP2 grantee who's starting to step toward the NSP1, NSP3 world of amendments that are beyond the part that was competed. They've earned money beyond what was competed for.
Karen asks, can you clarify the definition of privately owned properties on slide 21? Does this include properties owned by developers that were created because of NSP? For instance, a limited partnership between a nonprofit and a developer of a 75-unit rental property. Is that privately owned, or is privately owned single-family residential by a household? So what basically they're asking, Jesse, is we talked about the fact that the national objective applies to everybody, so all properties have to meet it. But the change of use rule for the reuse of the property only applies to properties owned by the grantee or a subrecipient.
Because a household is going to be bound by resale recapture and a resale or recapture, and your private developer is going to be bound by your agreements with them that are going to be, you know, specifying that they have to do a certain thing and by a certain time, meet certain cost guidelines and produce a particular product, get occupancy, and document it. So, you know, there's a very specific agreement governing the developer, and oftentimes they're handing off to a managing entity. And so change of use, just that rag doesn't apply to them. It just simply doesn't apply to them because other things do.
Right. Okay, good. All right, Holly, let's go back to the phone. We do have still a number of written-in questions we'll try to get to. But, Holly, do we have anybody on the phone?
We do. We'll take a question from Karen.
Hi, Karen.
That was timely because that was my write-in question. So
okay, good.
A follow-up to that is that in the description that was given, a developer was supposed to do X number of properties. The first properties that they got into had cost overruns, and so they weren't held accountable to the total number, which is why I wrote in the question. If they are not being held to that original contract, I'm a developer, I'm going to deliver 10 units. The risk that I'm taking is I know how to do this and that I can do it cost effectively. If I'm not held to that contractual obligation, then how is that not a conflict with the answer?
Sometimes it depends on the actual facts of the particular case. And John may not be talking about this case, but a case I worked on, the developer had done their due diligence. They'd done a phase one. They'd done a title history and the history of the property. They took on the risk they were willing to take on. They went in and started work, did the additional environmental work, and turned out that there was a contaminated plume in the underground water that just blew the budget out of the water. So it literally just blew up the whole development budget. It was a risk well beyond what the due diligence anticipated on anybody's side. In that case, the grantee can say, I'm restructuring the program around you. In a case like that, they actually renegotiated the development agreement to account for this wild card risk element that nobody knew was there.
Yeah, and in the case I mentioned, I was speaking more from the grantee's perspective in terms of overall accomplishments, but it is a contractual matter between the grantee and the developer or the subrecipient or whatever, and they have to make some judgments about what happened and the appropriateness of it and so forth.
And whether you make the developer swallow the cost, whether the cost of litigation are worth your time or not, whether if you have a lot of developers you're working with. Honestly, as a manager, sometimes you have to make an example of somebody to make clear that you're serious about your requirement. How hard a neighborhood did you pick? I mean, we have some grantees working in some contaminated neighborhoods, and they are having trouble holding the line on their developer agreement. Sometimes it's better to use a subrecipient in a way where you pay actual cost. It's a really good question.
Okay, well, that puts some definitions around it that it didn't have prior.
Good. Okay, great. Holly, do we have anybody else on the phone? Because we do have about 20 more questions on the written in.
We don't have any further questions over the phone lines.
Okay, so let's get to these written in questions. So Allison asked, several times a reference has been made to a single-use revolving fund with program income that is earned after project closeout. Can you please confirm this means one NSP eligible use, i.e. use B, purchase and rehab, or use E, redevelopment? If this isn't what is meant by single use, please be more explicit.
CDBG, one eligible activity. There's a little blurring between eligible activity and eligible use. And also, in CDBG, it also means the same national objective. So, basically the same customer base or client base. We would have to, we're going to look, when we get down to the real specifics, we're going to look at closeout for the post-closeout RLFs that pass across into, from NSP to CDBG land. We'll take a close look at the CDBG reg to make sure it can accommodate that overlay of NSP eligible uses. On the NSP side, we have plenty of guidance out there on revolving loan stuff. I don't have it in front of me exactly how we've set it between eligible use and eligible activity, but we're looking at like one product line.
So Jesse, you mean something like home buyer assistance or rental development or something like that?
Or multifamily gap financing.
Yeah, so it doesn't have to just be eligible use B. It could be a client type or an activity type.
Yeah.
I hope that helps, Allison.
It would be well-defined and with basically, one master eligible activity. You're doing ACT rehab. Rehab is a dominant eligible activity. acquiring vacant property and turning it back around, providing gap financing in those deals. That's, eligible use E.
Okay. Missy asks, if program income has been generated and there's money left in our line of credit for a particular activity, can the line of credit be utilized for an eligible project, or does program income still have to be used first? So the answer is program income has to be used first before you can tap your line of credit. You have to use your program income to pay the next bill. And then our next question, can we draw the line of credit after the expenditure date?
If you met the expenditure deadline, the answer is going to be yes. If you did not meet it, we're going to have to determine a corrective action, and there may be a recapture involved.
And then finally, Missy asks, if a subrecipient does not meet the national objective, who is held responsible ultimately, the lead or the sub?
The grantee. HUD holds the grantee responsible. The grantee should probably go after the sub, but we hold the grantee responsible. We have no contract with the sub.
That's why your agreements are so important.
Yes. All right, Ahmad asks, if a state grantee allows a subrecipient to acquire a foreclosed blighted structure and then demolish it, so they're acquiring and then demolishing, has a national objective been met for the closeout?
Well, it's probably been met for the demolition, but it probably has not been met for the acquisition.
Right.
Because there's no reuse of that property. So you've improved the neighborhood. Let's hope with an area benefit, but that means that your demolition met a national objective, but your acquisition is still looking for a way to meet its national objective
and to complete its eligibility. Because there's no acquisition standalone. It's all act and.
Okay, so hopefully that's clear. And again, if it isn't, please feel free to write into the Ask a Question box for follow-up. The next question is, we are planning to transfer a few houses within our current activities from resale to rental and to utilize additional program income for rental activities. This will help to comply with the 25% set-aside. Because we are not changing activities, we want to confirm that no additional amendment is required. So I think they mean the action plan. We'd also like to confirm that as long as all program income is allocated within the activity identified in our substantial amendment, no amendment is required.
Yeah, this is a pretty common misunderstanding. The amendments are actually required so that citizens can know how they're going to be affected. That's the primary reason. It's also because I'd like to know what's going on, but really, amendments that include program income are required so citizens can know how they're going to be affected and how they can participate in programs. If you're moving around small amounts of money and you're not adding and deleting an activity or changing the beneficiary, then you probably haven't triggered the need for a substantial amendment. But if you're budgeting substantial amounts of program income and you have never put them out there in an action plan, never put them out to citizens, you really need to go ahead and do that. Even, if you've gone ahead and gone underway and you're already working on it, still get it out there, meet your citizen participation, let them know what's going on. If you are changing tenure, it is true that our notice requirements are not, they're silent on the topic of tenure in general between homeowner and renter. And if you're talking about the same income group, whether, that they're under 50%, and you said you were going to do homeowner before and you're doing renter now, it's true, we don't specifically say that you have to go back out for citizen participation and do an amendment. But I would submit that citizens care about tenure. And it would be nice if you would at least notify them, even if you don't go through formal citizen participation on that point, and if your citizen participation plan is silent on that point. The same people may be the beneficiaries, but they're going to be affected differently by the different kinds of programs. So the answer on the program income is, yeah, if you're moving a big chunk of program income around, you better be doing an amendment.
Particularly if it's a new activity or a change of tenure, as you just said.
Or if it's just a big chunk of money. 1 or 2%, no, but if you're up there and you're talking about, it'll affect multiple units, it's going to make, it can make a dent in it, a sizable dent in a neighborhood on stabilization, then the people need to know how they're going to be affected and they need to see those budgets.
Great. All right, guys, we have about 10 questions left, so can you guys at HUD hang on and try to get through these?
Yeah.
Okay. So Jennifer asks, and folks who are on the phone, I hope you can stick with us. There's some good questions that folks have asked. Jennifer asks, DRGR now allows for supporting documents to be uploaded to the grant. Will there be specific documents that must be uploaded by the grantee prior to closeout of NSP 1 or 3?
Maybe. That's one of the, way down on the ground level we haven't got to. We actually put that data, that upload thing in so that people could add to their action plans and provide additional backup material. And it also, as the TA providers who are also in DRGR for their TA grants know, it's going to allow for a fair amount of supporting documentation around some of the technical assistance activities. We have not yet fully engaged, actually, with a big discussion. There have been ideas floated about what could be uploaded for closeout. The one that has the most traction is that we would maybe give people a closeout checklist and have you upload it to us so we could know that you were ready to close. But honestly, we have not come to closure on that. If people want to make suggestions, again, please send them in through your reps. We'd be happy to hear what you think that might be useful for.
Okay. Joanna asks, when is a project considered stalled?
Well, I mean, I think that's a term, we heard a couple of weeks ago on a webinar about a community that had houses that had been completed. The rehab was completed, and they'd been sitting on the market for a year or more. Clearly, that will be a stalled project. I think once they've gone past a couple of months, and you need to start thinking about alternative strategies. And let me suggest that one of those is to increase the amount of subsidy, not necessarily decrease the price, because what you might need to do is make that unit more affordable to somebody, but that doesn't mean you have to lower the sales price, because the sales price is going to be something that gets recorded. So there's different ways to do that, but if you just got one house and it's it's the one that's in a weird location and you're just having trouble selling it, that's that may be an outlier. But if all your houses are running into resistance or whatever, then you should talk to us about getting somebody out there to help you analyze that problem. Maybe you need to change your marketing. Maybe you need to change your that's what I was saying. Increase the investment. The soft second or whatever, to make it very affordable to somebody, or switch it over to a rental. All those things that we talked about on the disposition webinars.
Okay, so the next question we get is, will all the houses acquired to meet the obligation deadline have to be rehabbed by the deadline of March 2013? What if program income will be used to complete the rehab work?
Well, you have to spend by March 2013. You have to expend an amount equal to 100% of your grant. You won't be able to close your grant until you have occupied those houses, which will require you to rehab them. If you are confident about the program income coming in, that's one thing. If you're not so sure that you're going to have that program income, then you're going to have a problem between spending and meeting a national objective.
For some grantees, and they know who they are, real hot hands. They're running. They have multiple projects running all the time. Some of them are already blown right by the 100% expended and onto infinity. We're going to have trouble finding a really clean place to close out. We know that. We will work that out. We're going to find a moment when there's like a pause, and we will close, so that we want a clean, closeout, post-closeout break if we can get it. Because there's history here that I've dug up where we closed midstream on some urban renewal grants 40 years ago at HUD, and those turned out to be kind of messy. So we are going to have to approach, particularly the fastest moving grantees, who are really running a lot of projects really fast and they're past 100%, and say, you know, let's make a moment for a clean grant closeout.
Okay. And guys, we're getting more questions in as we're talking, so for our HUD folks, when you need to go, just tell us and we can wrap it up at that point. But we'll keep going until you're ready.
Okay.
The next question comes from Agnes. Are land banking grantees in the process of selling the properties in their land bank? Several of the homes need repairs, which are not eligible land banking expenses. So I'm guessing Agnes is asking, can we pay for those with NSP, or what do we do?
Well, I mean, you acquired these properties, and in order to be in a land bank, they had to be foreclosed upon. So you can use funds in Activity B or Activity E to treat those properties, and then take them out of the land bank with funds from, you know, assuming you have a budget left in some of those other line items. There's no problem at all with switching them out. And, you know, I've said many times, you're not limited to one eligible use. You're not limited to one letter. You can do C and D. You can do C, D, and E. So.
Great.
Steve asks, for state NSP 1 grantees that are using entitlement subrecipients, will the subrecipients be allowed to keep the program income, or must they return funds to the grantee? Is this decision the discretion of the NSP 1 state grantee?
It's at the discretion of the NSP 1 state grantee. When we come to the point of closeout with the grant with the state, we will be looking at what the state said in its grant agreement in the most current version of the grant agreement, should it choose to revise it between now and then.
Okay. Lori asks, we're a state NSP 1 grantee, and we've allowed our county subrecipients to retain all program income from their activities. At closeout, could HUD hold the subrecipient responsible to monitor and track their program income rather than the state, since the county is earning the 10% admin?
We will work that out at closeout, but right now, the idea we have is if you have an entitlement subrecipient that you have allowed to retain program income, we will be holding that entitlement responsible post-closeout for the projects that they did as your subrecipient.
Great. Okay.
Portfolio.
Okay, great. Rhonda asks, if NSP funds have been allocated to a nonprofit to acquire, rehab, and resell homes to very low-income households, assisting with meeting a 25% set-aside, and if properties are in escrow finalizing acquisition, and an estimated rehab cost has been submitted to the grantee, if the grant expenditure does not arrive, will these funds be considered submitted?
No. Those funds are, as we said on an earlier slide, you need to have an invoice or an expenditure, an outright expenditure for those. So now it is possible for a grantee to achieve 100% expenditure, and while not every single subrecipient has achieved that, and so that's a conversation that you need to have with your grantee and your subrecipient. But if you know, all things being equal, if that were the only subrecipient for this grant, then they would probably be in trouble.
Yeah, so just having it estimated or under contract or something like that is not going to count as expenditure. It has to be invoiced, completed and invoiced.
Only good for the 18-month obligation deadline.
And even then.
Ask a land banking question about being able to rehab those land bank properties, has amended it to note that they've got program income coming in from a subrecipient from prior sales, and the program income be used to repair the home held in the land bank to make them more attractive to potential buyers.
Well, you can use your program income for anything that you want it to. So if you want to use it for activity B or E, as we were suggesting, then you can do that. I mean, unless you have some restrictions on it or something.
Program income is still covered by the NSP rules. He means any NSP thing you want it to.
Right.
I thought we were talking about rehabbing the buildings out of land banks.
Yeah, that's what she means. So it sounds, Agnes, like as long as that rehab you're doing is eligible with your program income, you do it as a land banking activity, you would do it as an eligible use B or E, depending on the property.
Right. This will apply to any NSP fund, whether they're program income or line of credit.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it might be worthwhile to mention, because there seems to be a little bit of confusion out there. If you're purchasing, if you generate program income from doing an activity like fee, like acquiring a house, rehabilitating it, and then selling that house, and you earn program income on that, you can use that program income for any activity that you've approved in your action plan. It's not tied to B.
Unless you said in your action plan it's tied to B, in which case you need to amend your action plan.
Okay. Next question. We are a nonprofit grantee in NSP 2. When is rental income for a single-family home that is being rented treated as revolved 1? So this is similar to the previous question you guys had. The purpose of determining whether we've recycled it or not. So I think you guys were saying you're going to look into that.
Yeah, to be determined. I mean, we're maybe something like on a, after the first year or something like that. But this is an OMB process, OMB-driven process, but it's not one that we've really worked with. So we need to learn what those rules are. But we've got a few years to do that, right? Right.
No, we're going to figure it out by December. I am just held.
No. We can figure it out by then, but they don't have to do it by
then. Right.
True. All right. The next one is from Adanya. A subrecipient acquires a property with NSP funds under Activity B, but later discovers the cost to rehab is not feasible. The property is subsequently demolished using NSP funds because it meets the definition of blight. Has this property met a national objective? So they acquired it, they did not rehab, and then they demolished.
If the demolition met the national objective of area benefit because there was enough concentrated demolition in the area, or the property itself was big enough, and it affected the area generally, then it met the demolition national objective. But the acquisition doesn't have its and yet. It's acquisition and rehab, acquisition and redevelopment. Where's the and? Until you have the next use, you don't have the national objective for the acquisition.
The only case that would be allowable would be if they had not acquired it. They had just demolished it. Somebody else was doing the feasibility. But once you acquire it, you've done two things. You've acquired it and you've demolished it.
Okay.
Each one of those has to meet a national objective.
And that's driven by that statutory overlay from HERA, the eligible use overlay.
All right. Bill White asks, if an NSP1 multifamily project is under a HUD HAP contract, so I think that would be a public housing, I would believe, or perhaps it could be multifamily, will NSP monitoring be required after closeout? So I think the implication here is that somebody else is doing monitoring because it's under another HUD contract.
That's an excellent question. We've also gotten it in regard to tax credit projects that are under monitoring contracts by HFAs because there's tax credits in place. And CDBG allows for accepting income eligibility documentation that you're under a program at least as strict. I think we will probably follow that precedent and say that you are under a program at least as strict, and once you've documented that, we will walk away, provided that the HAP contract lasts for at least as long as the affordability period.
Okay. Jesse asks, if we do not sell all our houses that have been rehabbed by the deadline, will we be required to turn them into rentals, or how long will we have to try to get the houses sold past the deadline?
John's smacking the phone. I don't know why it upsets him so much.
All right, so what we said at the beginning of this, maybe you weren't here, was that you have to expend 100% of your funds by the deadline date, an amount equal to your grant. We are not going to close your grant until you have your homes occupied. Therefore, you have time to get these houses occupied. You have time. You don't have to put them into a temporary thing. If there's something that makes more sense that's permanent, that might take a month longer. They're two separate processes.
Hey, you guys, there's 213 of you left on the call. Of that, there's probably a big chunk of you are NSP grantees. I know you know another NSP grantee. Pick up the phone and tell them that the expenditure deadline is a separate thing from grant closeout. Make sure everybody knows this. The expenditure deadline is a separate thing from grant closeout. You've got to get through the expenditure deadline. You've got to meet national objectives. You've got to document where your program income is. We've got to get an inventory of the properties held by grantees and subrecipients before we can go to closeout. They are all separately moving, independent preconditions for grant closeout. So the expenditure deadline is just an expenditure deadline. It's not a project completion deadline. It is an expenditure deadline. Please pick up the phone, call another NSP grantee, and tell them, and make sure they know too.
And it might actually be, guys, that we should put out a listserv notice that says this too.
Yes.
Okay, Chris asks, could you give me some examples of one revolution for program income purposes? And again, remember, this only applies to those 14 NSP2 nonprofit grantees. If a grantee had $50 million, would they have to collect $50 million in program income to do one revolution, or will it be one revolution on a project-by-project basis?
We don't know yet.
Okay.
It was an idea John floated, okay? This is not set in stone yet. This is something that you know, we're thinking of as we're talking to you. This is, as we said at the beginning, you know, we're right out there in the cutting edge space on this.
Yeah, I mean, I have a hard time understanding it myself too. So, I mean, a clean one would be maybe you sell a house and you know that you rehabbed before closeout and you get $20,000 back. Then you spend it on something, and then when whatever you spend it on comes back, it's not covered. But I don't think it's going to be as clean as all that. You know, you're going to be selling and buying, and you're going to be getting rental income, and it's going to be a mess. So
we're going to try to clean it up as much as we can. Because to be honest, the ones that are closer to miscellaneous revenue are we're going to focus on those, but not yet. We have to deal with the case that deals with the 300. Before we can deal with the case that's just the 14, and then the 5 behind it of the public housing authorities and the redevelopment.
All right, Val asks, could you please clarify that state-funded NSP 1 must be in closeout by March 2013? So again, Val, we don't have to close out by March 2013 from a federal perspective. HUD's policy on this is that you can close out at some point after March 2013. However, your state, if you're a state recipient, I can't tell if you're a state or a state recipient, your state might have decided they want to close out earlier. They could have instituted a policy, perhaps because they want to make sure everything gets expended more quickly, that says they want to be closed out by March, and they could have instituted such a policy. So the answer is, from HUD's perspective, no, but perhaps from your state's perspective.
Yes, there are definitely states, I've been told recently, there are definitely states where the political leadership has decided that they will be ready for closeout in March, not because they're worried about the expenditure deadline, but because they want the money on the ground doing good by then. And that's up to the states. They can have decided that. It's up to entitlement that they want to push that hard.
But you don't need to do that.
But it's not the federal requirement. You do need to do it if you're a state grant recipient and your state's telling you you got to do it.
The only requirement in expenditure is to expend 100% of the funds.
The amount equals 100% of your grant.
But as Jesse said, guys, if your state has instituted that as its policy, and that's what it says in your state grant agreement between your recipient and the state, then you have to follow what the state has told you to do.
Yep.
Okay, so the next one from Katie says, what would I need to document an end use of green space or open space in an LMMA area?
Well, so I think the issue there is complicated by the fact that you may not be able to actually construct the green space or open space or whatever sort of, you know, any improvements to that with the NSP funds. If you're an NSP 1, maybe you can. The challenge there is to meet a national objective.
And to call it redevelopment. In most cases, you have to figure out how to call that redevelopment, which I'm perfectly open to.
Yeah. So I think the eligibility is not so big of a problem as paying for the eligible activity. And then but I think the underlying question is, well, you know, is it an area benefit activity? Yeah. I mean, it would be something like that would have to be an area benefit activity. You would have to look at who, you know, what physical area benefits from it, and you know whether the people in that area are meet the NSP criteria.
And the service area, I think we probably fall back on the service area guidance that for the guidance side as opposed to the regulatory side. In the entitlement CDBG desk guide, the guide to eligible activities, it's online on the CDBG entitlement page of HUD.gov. attachment like G or something to it is a few pages on how you determine a service area and determine whether it meets limited area benefit. I think we would probably just lean straight on that. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel, and it does cover parks and open space.
And I think most of these are going to be reasonably small area service areas. You know, you only sort of cross into a bigger area where you're talking about something like a regional park or something like that, and I don't think that's what you're likely to be constructing. So in that case, you know, you would be looking at, you know, maybe a census tract, maybe a couple of block groups. If you're doing a lot of this kind of activity, I'm guessing there's vacant lots. I'm guessing there's not very high income people. So I think you're going to find that you can cross that hurdle.
At 120% of median, you really should be able to cross it pretty easily.
So guys, only a few more questions. These are pretty straightforward. Blair asks, if a property is leased at closeout as part of a lease-to-purchase program, would it fulfill a national objective? And if so, which national objective would it fulfill?
Well, it would be a housing national objective, and I assume that it would meet a national.
LMNH?
Yeah.
As long as the occupant is low income.
Right. Yeah, so they're going to be income qualified.
Right.
Okay, the next question. How do we handle...
If the question is, you know, well, does a short-term renter count? The answer is yes. I mean, if they change the use, then they have to have, you know, a subsequent use that meets a national objective. But we're not going to say, well, you know, it's just a rental. We're going to wait till you have an owner because...
But for housing, it does need to stay housing, and it needs to be reasonably permanent for the housing national objective.
Next question, how do we handle rental income from a rental property which will become homeownership? How is this income tracked and by whom?
Well, we have some discussion in the program income policy that we published last July, I think, July of 2011, and you know, it talks about rental income and how you would treat that. But it would be anything that's basically in excess of you know, your cost of operating the project. So, and if you've refinanced it or if you financed it, you could even pay the debt service if it's all part of the same, you know, redevelopment. But you know, you can capitalize replacement reserves. So many people in that condition would not be having a lot of excess revenues.
You have to keep your math. It's like farmers making money.
All right, last question comes from Don. Returning to the question of acquisition demolition. What if a subrecipient purchases a vacant property for less than $25,000 and demolishes? What, if any, additional outcome must be met to satisfy the acquisition? So here, guys, I think we're getting change of use mixed up with the initial national objective. So I think we have to meet the initial national objective on the acquisition, but the change of use would not apply because we spent less than the 25.
No. Okay, ask the question again.
What if a subrecipient purchases a vacant property for less than $25,000 and demolishes? What, if any, outcome must be met to satisfy the acquisition?
Okay.
That's what I was saying. I think the initial acquisition has to meet a national objective.
Acquisition isn't eligible yet.
Right, exactly.
You have to have the and. Acquisition, it's not acquisition and demolition because that's not allowed. So you have to get through eligibility and then to the national objective.
Right.
And meet the national objective, and then you can talk about change of use. Change of use is where the $25,000 comes in.
That's exactly what I was saying, Jesse. Yeah.
I know, but it was the order. I just wanted to start with eligibility. You've got to start all the way back at the beginning. Acquisition alone is not eligible.
So yeah, so in order to have it be eligible, it has to meet an end use. The and.
Yeah.
So does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense.
So we haven't. So the CDBG regs at 57505 allow you to change the use, and for a property that's less than $25,000, to take it out of the program without further consideration. We had originally suggested that would be a way to treat properties of low value, and it's possible that we still will allow some of that. We have had some concerns with the volume of properties in some grantees, and it's a handful. But we don't want hundreds of properties passing out, of low-value properties passing out of the program with no further consideration or no further requirements. We might allow a scattered use of that, a small amount of that, but we haven't really landed on that yet.
Yeah, but you've got to meet you're not even in the land of that 25,000 until you meet a national objective the first time.
Yeah, so hopefully that was clear, Don. Jesse, anything else to add on that? So would they trigger the change of use for a secondary once they've initially met the national objective, since they've spent less than $25,000 for a reuse of that property? They would not, right?
Well, so Jesse, are you saying that that meeting the national objective with the demolition of the house is insufficient
for the acquisition because it hasn't been made eligible yet? Yeah, there's some people that come in. Do you have to acquire under eligible use B? Any of the eligible uses, there's always something attached to acquisition, in addition to acquisition, to get to eligibility, and then you also have to meet the national objective. So you have to acquire and redevelop, or acquire and and then you're going to dispose for a land bank. You're going to acquire and redevelop in E, and that redevelopment must meet a national objective. Then, once you've done that, you can use the 25,000.
Yeah, I think that's what we're trying to clarify.
So if you acquire and your redevelopment is to plant it all in sunflowers, and you have that there for a while, and you decide to change the use from an area benefit use to doing something else, and the property is under 25,000, then you might have, a situation where you can be using the change of use requirement.
Okay. Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to make sure we clarified for folks.
But you got to have the and. You have to have a plan for the property you got beyond demolition.
So hopefully that was clear for everybody. So I think we're through our questions now. If people do have additional, or if you've written in some since we've been through the last batch, I want to encourage you to use the Ask a Question function on the NSP Resource Exchange, and questions have been being answered fairly quickly, so I encourage you to make use of that. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to John and Jesse for any closeout comments and thoughts.
Well, John's wandered off. He got called out of here by the people that came in a few minutes ago. I would definitely urge you to, fill out the survey about this presentation. We kind of took a risk here and came out with, a preview of coming policy attractions. And because a lot of grantees have asked us to go ahead and do that, and we are still listening and still writing. We will definitely try to answer people's questions as quickly as we can. But closeout isn't something that the CDBG program has a huge amount of experience with, and we're treading carefully now that we've realized that we may be making policy in some areas for the next decade by setting up this notice. We'd like to get it as clean and clear as we can. So we really appreciate. We had really great attendance on this webinar. And
it's 4:30, and there's still 158 people on the call.
Yeah,
so
you're a tough 158.
People are sick.
So we're just. I'm sorry, we're really, really punchy.
Somebody just dropped off.
We appreciate all the questions.
I'm not sick.
We appreciate all the questions. Keep them coming. And thank you for everybody who's stayed and asked questions and is listening. We appreciate all the hard work.
We're sorry we don't have all the answers, but we wanted to give you the general shape of things. And so, if you could be patient on the details, we're working on them.
all of you are still on, if you have ideas for other webinars or follow-up to this that you need more clarification, by all means, please fill out the evaluation that you're seeing on the screen here, and you'll get an email as well, and let HUD know what else you'd like to see. All right, well, thank you, HUD, for doing this and for really providing this innovative and new frontier of information. So I think everybody appreciates it, and thanks everybody on the phone for sticking with us. Have a good afternoon.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. And again, ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude our conference for today. We thank you for your participation. You may now disconnect.